Hello, everyone. We good to go? Yeah, we're recording. Yeah. Hello. If I can get your attention, please. Cool. Okay. Fáilte Cork. Welcome to University College Cork for the 15th International Seabird Group Conference. Quick thank you to all of our sponsors shown here on screen. They've been a massive help. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Emily Shepard from Swansea to give our first session's plenary. She is at the cutting edge of biologging science, using some really sci-fi level technology to look at the mechanisms underlying flight and other behaviours in seabirds. It's very pertinent to seabirds as they experience some extreme conditions at sea, and looks at some really original questions. So when returning to the colony, how winds affect how they can land in their nests, and looking at how storms affect how they travel at sea and their distribution. So really lovely research. She has a really prestigious ECR starter grant for her flight project. Going from the lab to the field, it involves a wind tunnel, some very well-behaved pigeons. It's really impressive. From my own experience, she was a gracious host when I visited, a valuable collaborator, and a really kind person. So, without further ado, Professor Emily Shepard.
Thanks so much for the introduction. How great to be here. I'm so looking forward to this whole conference. The programme looks amazing, and it's just such a pleasure to be having, well, the prospect of having live talks again without all of us editing out the imperfections. So, as Jamie said, I'm going to be talking about wind today. And we all know that the ocean environment is a windy place. So this is a pretty random screen grab, or random in terms of it's one day in August, showing us the wind field. And what you can see is that if you compare land to sea at any given latitude, it's much windier over the sea. It's about twice as windy, in fact. So for terrestrial animals, actually, particularly those living in places like forests, wind is actually, well, it can be pretty irrelevant in terms of how it affects their day-to-day movements and day-to-day lives. But that's extremely rare, or seldom that's going to be the case over the sea. And one of the reasons that wind is so relevant for the daily movements of seabirds is that it has a profound impact on their flight costs. And it can affect their individual movement decisions, where they go, and it can also affect population-level processes because of this link between wind and flight costs. So I'll just run through a few examples of that quickly. For flapping flyers, we know that the stronger the headwind that birds are flying into, the more it costs them to fly. And this is an example of one of those relationships that was actually quantified by Kyle Elliott and his group. So he used various metrics to look at energy expenditure in MERS, thick-billed MERS. And we've got the headwind component on the x-axis, and we've got wing beat frequency and dynamic body acceleration as two different metrics of energy expenditure on the y. So the stronger the headwind, the more it's costing them to fly. And he found similar relationships for black-legged kittiwakes. And actually, in the case of the MERS, their flight cost is so high that what he found was that in really strong headwinds, these birds chose to reduce their foraging distance in order to reduce their energy expenditure. And when you get really predictable patterns of wind circulation at a regional scale, we all know, well, many of us know that actually this can lead to the formation of migratory flyways with a whole range of different species capitalizing on tailwinds to route their migrations. And this is just one example of that. This is from Henri Weimerskish, a paper that he had on frigate birds showing that the migration occurs around the Indian Ocean in such a way that birds are capitalizing on the tailwinds. Dynamic soaring species have a very particular relationship with wind because the windier it is, the less they flap and the less energy they spend. And this was shown by a really beautiful study back in 1996 where Bob Furness actually dosed northern fulmars with doubly labelled water to measure their field metabolic rate and showed that that went down as the wind speed increased. So, happy days. If it's windy, then it's low-cost flying for dynamic soaring birds. And this can have a profound effect on, even macroecological processes, or patterns rather. If you look at where the Procelariform species diversity is highest, it's in the Southern Ocean, the roaring 40s and 50s, where you've got high wind speed, into low flight costs and high flight speed. So their capacity for low-cost flight means that actually this is where we see up to 42 species of procelariforms. So all this is to say that there are very clear mechanisms linking wind to the costs of flight, and that can have knock-on consequences for not only individual level movement but population level processes. But today I want to look at a different aspect of wind. I want to consider when it might become risky for birds in flight. I'm going to look at two different areas, and first I'm going to start looking at extreme winds at sea, so the effects of storms. Storms are a really important area, not least because the maximum wind speeds that occur in storms are increasing. There's this really nice study which showed that over a 20-year period in Science. And that's true for almost all of the world's oceans. So storm speeds are getting stronger. And we know that seabirds are affected by storms. So after storms, you often find a lot of vagrants, so birds that might be displaced hundreds or even thousands of kilometres from their normal foraging area, which means that these storm winds can actually have a huge impact on individuals. It's also, if you get storms in the breeding season, then you can get marked mortality at the nest, with young being actually physically washed off the nests, or things like tree branches falling on the young as well. And then, of course, there are wrecks. So wrecks of hundreds, potentially thousands of birds, often dead, but sometimes living and in a bad shape, that get washed ashore following the passage of storms. So I think what we understand less about is really, we don't have a framework for understanding which particular elements of storms are risky for which species. We can get some information from looking at bird wrecks themselves, and I've kind of cherry-picked some examples from the literature to really show the scale of mortality that can occur in the wake of storms. So just starting with some auk data, winter storms, you can see, have caused massive mortality, with sometimes tens of thousands of individuals being washed up. And those are just the birds that are washed up. So obviously it's pretty hard to go from the numbers of birds that have counted to a true estimate of the mortality that occurs in a wreck. And these, as I said, these are winter storms. And winter storms are quite particular because they're large areas of low pressure that can come and settle over the ocean. And they can come in succession, so one can come hot on the heels of another. And they can be hard to predict. And what I mean by that is that when you have tropical cyclones, there is a very clear storm eye, and that storm eye tracks through, has a storm path. So that's in contrast to this region of low pressure that can come and sit over an area of the ocean. So auks, as I said, have very high flight costs. So this is a really bad combination. They've got high flight costs. How are they going to outrun a storm? It seems extremely unlikely that they would be able to actually avoid a really large area of a storm. So they have to sit it out. And there was a really nice study last year which actually showed that it's most likely that the main cause of mortality for auks in winter storms is because storms disrupt their ability to feed. So winds are impacting auks, but possibly it's the indirect effects on their ability to feed that are the most critical. That's backed up by the condition of lots of birds that have been examined in wrecks, and most of them, in many cases, are really emaciated. This is a barrel of laughs. What a jolly way to begin the conference. But even what's one of the interesting things is it's not just auks that wreck after storms. Even species that are wind adapted wash up. So here are some examples of different species, which are, most of them are dynamic soaring birds. So I guess the main message is that to be wind adapted doesn't necessarily mean that they're immune to the effects of these extreme winds that happen in storms. And the causes of mortality appear to be a bit more varied, so it's not necessarily clear why they're getting wrecked. In some cases, you do see emaciated individuals. Sometimes it's large groups of juveniles that wreck. But then there are other, people have recorded quite a wide range of different potential causes of mortality in these birds. So that raises an interesting question. What is it about extreme winds that would be risky in this scenario? of this group of birds. And we could actually use biologging data to tell us a little bit about that. So if we're looking at the movements of individuals, what is it that they avoid? Well, that would be a great thing to look at, but actually it's really hard to get those data because storms are, by definition, extreme or infrequent events. So you need a huge amount of data to actually be able to capture the instances where birds are operating in these rare events. And also to look at what happens over multiple storms, because no two storms are the same. So luckily, some people in our community have been amassing incredible data sets and actually tracking individuals over very long periods of time. And this can enable us to actually look at what happens in rare events such as storms. So one of those people is Ken Yoda, who's been tracking streaked shearwaters in the Sea of Japan for many years. Actually, we were looking at a data set of his which stretched over 11 years, where he'd been collecting GPS data from over 400 individual shearwaters. And Japan, the issue of storms is really relevant in Japan because Japan borders the world's most active cyclone basin. So this is a plot of all storm tracks in the IB Tracks database. Each line is the path of the eye of a storm, and you can see that they're coloured according to storm intensity. So this is the region where you're getting the strongest cyclones. Quick note on terminology. So cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons, they're all essentially the same thing, but the nomenclature varies depending on where they occur in the world. I'm just going to use cyclones for the events which have got the strongest winds, but also we're going to be looking at storms, where the maximum wind speed is slightly less. And I'm going to be presenting some work largely done by Manos Lempidakis, who is here, looking delighted because he's just come out of his Viva. So he was doing this as part of his PhD. And we were also working very closely with Andrew Ross, who's a meteorologist at the University of Leeds. And these are some of the data that we were looking at. So we've got Honshu Island here, and you can see the extent of these birds' movements within the Sea of Japan. So the first thing that Manos did was actually say, okay, this is an enormous data set, I'm going to filter it to just find the cases where he had birds flying in the Sea of Japan at the same time as a storm was passing through. And that reduced the data set to 75 shearwaters that were operating in 10 different storms. But we still had a reasonably high amount of flight data. And some of these storms were really quite strong. So we had maximum wind speeds, estimated wind speeds of up to, over 40 meters a second. That's almost 150 kilometers an hour. So this is just a density map of where the birds were operating. And these are the tracks of the storm eyes that passed through the Sea of Japan at that time. And it might look by plotting the tracks of the eyes, it makes them look like they're really quite sort of discrete. But don't be fooled because, discrete as in not far-reaching. But when you look at the wind fields surrounding the eye of those storms, the extent of these systems can be huge. So we can see the wind speeds of up to 20 meters a second stretching for a really goodly portion of the whole Sea of Japan. So what are these birds going to do about it? Possible responses could include avoidance. There was a paper by Henri Weimskirch and Aurélien Prudhomme which showed that actually in frigate birds and boobies that were breeding on Europa Island in the Mozambique Channel, that's what, the juveniles sat out storms. So this is the timeline here and the wind speed on Europa. You can see it's kind of normal conditions and then suddenly spikes as a storm passes really almost directly, I think it was over Europa itself. And when the wind spikes, if you look at the numbers of birds departing the colony to forage, there's a dip here. And the juvenile boobies and the juvenile frigate birds, that's when they basically stopped going to sea. Another option could be for birds to circumnavigate the system. And this is a figure from a theoretical study which showed that one of the optimal responses to rotating wind fields is for birds to use tailwinds to go from their current location back to their goal, which is here. And interestingly, in that same study of frigate birds and boobies, this is a response that was also seen. So here's the eye of the storm, and birds actually use tailwinds to circumnavigate the eye and go back to Europa. But those weren't dynamic soaring species. So perhaps they'd be more sensitive to the winds. Could there be another option? Might these birds even ignore and just carry on as usual? I have heard some people say that actually when they were looking at albatross movements in the Southern Ocean, they didn't seem to be too bothered by storms. But even that in itself would be interesting because it would tell us about the wind speeds and wind conditions that these birds are able to operate in. So we don't have information on whether birds decided to go to sea or not in relation to the wind strength. But what we do have is information on whether birds chose to sit on the sea surface or keep flying, according to the wind speed. And here we've got the wind speed, here we've got the proportion of birds that were flying and the proportion of birds that were sitting on the water surface. And you can see that there really isn't a very strong, consistent signal that the birds were sitting on the water surface as it got windier and windier. So birds seem to carry on flying. And then the next thing that Manos did was to animate the tracks of the shearwaters in relation to the wind field. I'm just going to show you some results from one storm. So you're going to see the shearwaters moving around here, and the storm's going to come in from the south. All storms track through the Sea of Japan from the southwest to the northeast in this direction. Shearwaters moving around. You can see the wind speed starting to increase down here. The black is the storm eye. And you can see some birds flying straight towards it and tracking it. Another storm comes on the back of it, and then even this bird goes after the second storm as it comes through. So that was a response we just didn't predict. We were really amazed. Okay, these guys aren't bothered by high wind streams, but to fly towards the eye of the storm, that seemed to be pretty incredible. And at first we were actually wondering, well, are they seeking refuge in the eye? Is it because the wind speeds in the eye are lower? Well, this is a schematic, if you like, of the anatomy of a storm that I've just pinched from the web. And here's the storm eye. And this is really largely what the wind speed does as you travel towards the eye. It increases right up to the point where you enter the eye itself. So there might be low wind speeds in the eye, but those low wind speeds are surrounded by really high wind speeds in the eye wall. And when we look at the distances between the shearwaters and the eye itself, well, in general, storm eyes have a diameter of about 20 to 50 kilometers. 13 birds came within 60 kilometers of the central point of the 5 strongest cyclones, and 4 birds came within 30 kilometers. So it's hard to be precise about the actual diameter of each storm that these birds were operating in, but it seems that actually several birds are operating in regions where the winds are likely to be extremely strong, if not some of the strongest speeds. It's also really hard to estimate the absolute maximum wind speeds that birds flew in, because we're looking at ERA 5 data, which is a reanalysis model of the wind speed, which is informed by real observations. And it's known that ERA 5 estimates actually underestimate the maximum wind speeds in storm conditions. But we think that birds were flying in at least winds of 21 meters a second. So the obvious question is why? Why are birds flying towards the eye of the storm? And what Manos did was he modeled the movement, the flight direction of the shearwater in relation to the eye of the storm, this moving target. And he found that actually, as wind speed increased, the birds were more likely to fly towards the eye. But the wind speed wasn't the only part of the story. So I don't want to dwell too much on this. Interaction plots are horrible. I just want to kind of highlight one point, which is that, well, we've got wind direction here and wind speed on this axis. So if you look at what's happening above sort of 15 meters a second, so in the really strongest conditions, you can see there's there are two different responses. In north and east winds, birds flew away from the eye, and in south winds, birds flew towards it. So to really understand what that means, we have to kind of put this in some spatial context. And this is Honshu Island, and this is the schematic of a storm wind field. So, as I said, they move in this direction through the Sea of Japan, and it moves winds are moving in an anti-clockwise direction. So this is the core foraging area, and when birds are to the north of the eye, that's when they experience easterly winds. And that's when we have birds moving away from the eye. And when birds are to the west of the storm, that's when they're going to be experiencing northerly winds. And again, in this scenario, they move away from the eye. So when birds are to the north and to the west, they're using tailwinds to circumnavigate the system. It's when they're on their core foraging area, here, that they experience southerly winds. So here the wind is actually moving up, almost parallel to the coast. And in this scenario, circumnavigation is going to be extremely difficult, because it would either mean that birds could use a tailwind and try and circumnavigate the storm by going ahead of it, but storms can move at 20 meters a second themselves, so the storm's probably going to catch up with them. If they tried to circumnavigate by going behind the storm, they're going to fly into a really, really strong headwind, which is unlikely to be possible or efficient. So what they do instead is they use a crosswind, which is a really efficient strategy for dynamic soaring flyers, to fly towards the eye of the storm. So I guess the other option could have been, staying put. So why didn't they do that? And the reason we think is because if they'd stayed put and the storm had moved in this direction, then they're going to get hit by storm strength onshore winds. So these winds here, which are moving towards the shore, would come towards the bird. And that's probably, it's bad karma if you're a dynamic soaring bird. Because if you've got a really strong onshore wind, you could be drifted towards the land, and that risks landing without full flight control, which means the risk of injury could be really high. Or if these birds were drifted over land and they managed to land with control, they've got limited takeoff capacities, so they might not be able to actually get to leave the spot where they've landed. And there we know that these birds are vulnerable to predators, to raptors and to corvids. So that's why we think that birds are moving towards the eye. They're moving towards the eye because it's the high wind speeds. The high wind speeds themselves aren't necessarily the risky bit. It's when they've got high onshore winds that's when these storms represent a risk. So we wanted to kind of drill down into the responses to land in a little bit more detail. Manos ran a separate model to look at the flight direction of the shearwaters to the closest point on land. And he found that actually as the wind speed increased, birds flew away from the land. So they seem to be avoiding land as in storm conditions. And when we look at the response to both the land and the eye of the storm, we find that birds only flew to the eye if that meant that they were flying away from land. So this is kind of supporting our hypothesis and they're trying to avoid strong onshore winds. And we thought, we can do one other thing. We can say, what happens if birds are moving in a way that, if they're only responding to the wind field, if they have no knowledge of land? And we used some agent-based modelling to address this question. So Manos seeded the core foraging area with 400 agents, and they did not have any knowledge of where the land was, or any response to the land. And then he exposed those agents to the wind field of the 5 strongest storms that we had in the data set. And the agents were programmed to move only in response to the wind field. So that was the output of our original model of how birds fly with respect to the storm eye. And then we just looked at when and how often birds were stranded over land. Well, birds, I mean agents, when agents were stranded over land. And they did strand in some, and they didn't strand in others. So here's an example of a storm where these agents didn't strand. So here comes a storm, this is the eye, and you can see that actually they only start to move when the storm is within a certain distance to them. So they're starting to move now, and some movement towards the storm, but not a huge response to the storm. And actually really no agents moved over land. Here is a case where got our agents again, got the storm moving towards them, and you can start to see that pretty quickly a lot of agents are drifted over land. And when we compare the storms where they did and didn't strand, something quite clearly pops out, which is that in these scenarios, where they did not strand, they were still exposed to really strong wind fields, but at the point of the maximum wind speed, which is what each of these screen grabs represents, where the agents are, they're not experiencing onshore winds, strong onshore winds. But in the cases where we had a lot of agent strands, they were. So in Storm Kompasu, it actually wasn't the strongest storm in our data set, and yet most of the agents were exposed to very clear onshore wind. And in Talim, almost 20% of agents stranded, and again, they were exposed to a clear onshore wind. So all of this suggests that actually birds need a response not only to the wind, but also to the land in order to avoid being stranded over land. And this flexible, I think one of the things that for me is most interesting is the flexible response of adults to these storm systems, sometimes circumnavigating, sometimes flying towards the eye, depending on where they are and where the storm is. And to me, this suggests that actually adults know three things. They know where the storm is, they know where they are, and they know where land is. So if they've got all this kind of kit to help them avoid storms, then why do they strand? Why do they actually get washed up onto sea, sometimes still alive? Well, it turns out that adults don't really. It's the juveniles that get stranded, and are particularly prone to wrecking. So what is it about juveniles which might make them more susceptible? It could be something completely unrelated to flight. It could be that actually they're just not as good at foraging in the wake of the storm. We can't discount that. They may well, in a study in a study about boobies and frigate birds, they showed that juveniles did respond to extreme winds. So we don't know whether juveniles know where the storm eye is, but they do seem to have a response to storm conditions. But when it comes to knowing where the birds are and where land is, we know that juveniles have very different navigational capacities to adults. So juveniles migrate and actually tend to use a compass bearing to navigate. And this was shown very nicely for streaked shearwaters by Ken Yoder back in 2017. So streaked shearwaters migrate south, and he tracked adults, and he showed that these birds went round land. But he also tracked juveniles, and he showed that most of the time they're migrating overland, taking a southern compass bearing to get to the same migration, non-breeding grounds. So risky business. They find hundreds of juveniles stranded over land during the migration season. When it does suggest that these juveniles don't know where land is, they don't have a map, actually, rather, of the land location. And therefore, this could be one of the reasons why they're more prone to onshore drift. Okay, well, this was a really fun system to work with, but maybe this whole strategy of flying towards the eye is just something that shearwaters do in the Sea of Japan, because they are surrounded by land masses on all sides. So they've got to have a very particular strategy for avoiding storms. Well, we were doing another study, and this was an analysis led by Elham Noorani at Max Planck. And she was analysing a monstrous amount of data, some data from 18 species of seabirds, the tracking data, to look at their responses to wind. And it's important to say that she wasn't specifically looking for when birds flew towards the eye of the storm, But she did find cases where 2 species of albatross flew towards it. So, hopefully, the GIF is going to kick in. Oh, it did it in the check. Let's try again. There we go. So there's our Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross, and you can see it flying into the eye of the storm, tracking it, before then it carries on its way. And in this scenario, yes, well, there is land here, but it's not like this bird is surrounded by land. So it kind of raised a really interesting possibility for us, which was that maybe this is a more general strategy that protolariforms can adopt in order to avoid drift that would be disadvantageous to them for whatever reason. It's likely to be a strategy that we only see in protolariforms because they have this very fast flight and this ability to operate in very high wind speeds. And also, I think, requires a map of where land is, where birds are and where they do and don't want to go. Okay, I'll leave the storms aside and just focus on when birds actually come into land. So there's one time, obviously, in the year where birds have to come back to land. And this is a risky business, even without storms. And it can and it does go wrong, even though we might not see it very often. And I love this. I really love this clip. I'm sure everyone's seen it, but I'm going to show it again. So it's a royal albatross in New Zealand, gloriously wiping out on its landing. So I don't think it got injured, just lost all dignity. But I wanted to show that not only because it's a great film, but also just to say that the flight control in those last moments of coming into land is crucial. Birds have to have that flight control in order to minimize the chance of injury. And just to kind of take a step back and think about landings in a more general sense, what landing involves is a really fast-moving object coming towards the ground, a solid substrate, really fast. It's essentially a controlled collision. And Boeing did a review of what caused fatal accidents over a 10-year period, and they found that 48% of fatal accidents occur in the final approach and landing, which is huge when you think about what a small proportion of the flight that represents. Pilots know very well that this is a risky business. There's some fascinating data where people actually hooked up pilots with heart rate monitors, and they found that their hearts are really beating fast when they're coming into land. So in international airports, they had heart rates of 130 to 150 beats per minute. And heart rates in glider pilots can be even higher, which makes sense because they don't have a motor to help them out if things start to look a bit dicey. So the reason that this is kind of risky is that flying objects, planes or birds, have to do 2 things when they're coming into land. They've got to maintain the flow of air over the wings, maintain their airspeed, which is what gives them flight control, enables them to keep flying. But they've got to reduce the ground speed, reduce the speed over which they're moving over the substrate, because it's that which is going to determine the impact when they land. So planes do this. They've got nice long runways, and they touch down and they slow down using their wheels. Obviously, that's not a strategy available to birds. So birds do slow down a lot in this final phase of landing, but then they've identified where they want to land, and they stall in that last moment over the landing spot. And that is when this critical deceleration occurs from their flight speed, landing flight speed, to 0 meters per second. And it's that deceleration which is going to determine the impact or the landing force. So, back to GCSE physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. The landing force in this case is going to be determined by the body's bird mass and the deceleration of when the bird actually hits the ground. So high deceleration leads to high landing forces and a higher likelihood of injury. So they've got to get it right. And this is something so we wanted to look at the impact of wind on this delicate balancing act. And we did this by collecting some data on scoma with auks. And these auks are largely breeding on cliffs. And so the impact of wind when birds are actually coming into land on a cliff, well, it wasn't actually obvious necessarily which way this was going to go, how wind would influence things. In terms of flight capacity, auks have a very high wing loading, so that just means that they've got a very large body mass per unit of wing area. So that means they're fast flyers, and their maneuverability is relatively low. And what we did was we looked at birds coming into land, and it's quite obvious when they've got that intention to land, because if there's the cliff, birds will come in, they'll often swoop up, and then right at the last minute, they'll either land or they'll turn around again and swoop down. If they land, we scored that as successful, and if they turn around and don't land at the last minute, we scored that as an aborted landing. So we looked at the number of aborted landings in relation to the wind speed. And this is what we found. So the probability of landing is on the y, and wind speed is on the x. And you can see that up to about 6 meters a second, landing all the time, absolutely no problem. But after that, the probability of landing declines quite rapidly. So then the question is, okay, well, how often do these birds actually experience strong winds when they're coming into land? When we look at the frequency of different wind speeds within the whole breeding season, well, most of the time, they're absolutely fine. That's the median wind speed, almost 5 meters a second. But in the reasonable maxima, we find that birds are going to have a tough time. So in the maximum they're likely to experience, we get failures of over 50%. The other thing that we found is that the size of the platform that they're landing on matters. So birds coming into land on these large platforms have a higher success rate than birds coming into land on small platforms. And when you think about the area available to the birds in both scenarios, the area of land, it might not be that different, because they can be landing on very crowded ledges. So they've still actually got to maneuver themselves into quite a small landing spot. In this case and in this case. But one of the key differences is that here it's quite open above the landing space. So there's quite a lot of airspace for the birds to actually enable themselves to maneuver in that last phase in relation to the wind. So what we think is happening is that high wind speeds means strong gusts. So birds are coming in that last critical phase when they're just about to stall and touch down. If they get hit by a gust, it's easier for them to respond to that, to maneuver in relation to the wind, where they've got more airspace above the landing spot. You'll notice I'm moving between species here. It's because we actually collected data from common guillemots and from razorbills. Razorbills were better at landing in all scenarios. And razorbills, as you'll know, are more likely to breed in these smaller smaller ledges. So they're smaller, they've got lower wing loading, they're more maneuverable. So it also shows, again, that even at this kind of level, these are a comparison between guillemots and razorbills, morphology matters in terms of how they respond to wind. And we started to wonder, okay, well, could this have implications? Could this, in terms of where birds choose to breed? Looking at cliffs on where seabirds breed, it's not always obvious why they might be in very crowded areas on some cliffs and actually very few birds on others, or none. So we took a quick look at how wind speed could affect the decision of where the larger colonies form. We did this by using computational fluid dynamics. So you take a digital elevation model of an island, and with CFD you flow air over it, and you use that to predict things like the wind speed and the turbulence and the updrafts and the downdrafts, and how those vary all around in this case, Skoma. And what we found was that 80% of the largest colonies on Skoma could be predicted by a really simple model of what the wind's doing, which showed that birds are selecting sheltered sites. And we know that the availability of breeding ledges is going to be important for these birds. But this model didn't have any information about that. So it shows that even taking a very simplistic approach, we can predict most of where the breeding birds occur just from the wind and the shelter. And that same model could predict 73% of the largest colonies on the neighbouring island of Stockholm. So it's not all about the ability to land, right? Shelter can be important for a whole range of reasons. If you're sheltered from the prevailing wind, then you're probably sheltered from a lot of rain and a lot of storm swell. And all of these reasons might be important in their breeding habitat selection. But I think one of the key points for me is that actually the failure rates that we recorded, those aborted landings, that's what we see even when birds have stacked the odds in their favour by selecting the sheltered sites. Okay, so does that mean that shelter is always what matters? No, because of course different species have different needs. And back in 1964, there was a paper by Cohn showing that albatrosses seem to select windward sides of the island to breed. And this went on to suggest that actually, it's the winds which can facilitate takeoff and also landing. And really interestingly, they actually said that they had observations of failed landings, and this led to fatalities in albatrosses. And it kind of makes sense, because going back to F equals ma, large birds with large body masses are going to potentially experience high landing forces and therefore be more prone to injury and maybe even mortality during landings, or botched landings rather. And wing shape is also likely to be important. So with long, thin wings, if a bird just catches the end of it, that's much more likely to lead to fracture than if a bird's got a short, rounded wing. I'm actually just going to finish by looking at some data from northern gannets. And these are data collected by the legendary Sarah Wanless during her PhD, where she was working on Ailsa Craig in Scotland. And on Ailsa, there were 300,000 breeding birds. And during her PhD, she noticed that at the bottom of these talus slopes, on these talus slopes at the bottom of the breeding cliffs, she would find gannet carcasses. And she found a lot of them, 367 during her monitoring period. It's up to 28 a month. And she noticed that the most common cause of death was a broken wing or neck, usually accompanied by severe internal hemorrhaging. She thought that it was sustained as the bird struck the rock during its fall or during the impact when it fell on the talus slope at the bottom. And her feeling was that this was something to do with landings. And actually, so it could be that this is the case where botched landings are leading to surprisingly high mortality. And we started, she got in touch after I was talking about the Ork landing study. And so we went back to the data from her PhD. And one of the fantastic things about Era 5 data, the wind data that's available through reanalysis models, is that you can go back in time and predict the wind speed back in the 1970s. So we extracted the wind speeds and directions when Sarah was collecting these data and the carcasses. And there's a bimodal distribution of winds. You get southerly winds and northwesterly winds. And when you look at the number of carcasses that she picked up as a function of the frequency of low winds, the wind direction mattered. So in southerly winds, there's really no relationship between the number of carcasses that she found and the frequency of low winds. But it's actually a really strong relationship between the frequency of northwesterly winds and the carcass count in any given month. And I was amazed by this because I just thought, well, these data are quite coarse, so we're looking at monthly averages and still this strong relationship has popped out. So what's happening? We used some CFD again to predict what the wind would be doing over Ailsa, according to whether it's coming from the south or the northwest. And you can see that these areas that Sarah's outlined in black are the breeding sites. And if you look at those areas on the simulated, on the digital elevation model, in a south wind, they're much windier than they are in a north wind of the same wind strength. So the topography is altering the way that the wind moves around the island and means that actually it's really pretty wind still in a northwest wind. This could be key for both landing and takeoff, in fact. So I think, well, I kind of alluded to this before, but gannets are going to be landing into wind, and they're using that wind to reduce their ground speed and help them control their landing. Wind could also be important during landing if the wind's coming into the cliff and actually being deflected upwards and creating an updraft that the birds are using to help them as they maneuver over their landing spot and control their landing again. Wind could be important in takeoff because it helps them gain that critical airspeed, which means that they can have the lift, sufficient lift to get out over the talus slopes and out to sea. So without the wind, that might be a contributing factor to why birds might fall on the slopes. So we can't distinguish between these two in terms of which might be more important, but I guess they're kind of interlinked because if birds botch a landing, they kind of have to go into a takeoff again and get up their airspeed. So there's a link there. And you might be thinking, okay, well, there are quite a lot of carcasses, but this is a low level of mortality. 0.5% of the population, in fact. Does this matter? Well, I guess there are two things to say. Firstly, that even low levels of mortality can be important for these long-lived birds. But the other thing is that the landscape of risk could be analogous to the landscape of fear. So we all know that animals don't have to see predators for those predators to shape the way that the animals move through, the prey move through the environment. They can prey. The landscape of fear means obviously that prey movements are affected by the probability of encountering a predator. And it could be that this landscape of risk could actually be impacting seabirds in a similar way, in that the risk is there, and that could shape where they potentially choose to breed. So, a few take-homes. Wind is really important in affecting how birds interact with the land. High winds can be risky, low winds can be risky. Depends on the scenario and on the bird's morphology. So, the probability that birds might be injured during landing can potentially vary with these morphological factors. And then those morphological factors can potentially interact with environmental factors to influence how birds come into land and potentially even more broader patterns of space use. So before I sign off, I just want to say there's a huge amount of collective wisdom and field experience in this room, and I'd be really interested to talk to anyone who has any interesting observations about birds coming into land or taking off. So please do reach out, even if I'm behind a mask. I'd be fascinated to chat. And then before I go, I'll just say, well, I need to thank a huge number of people who I've been working with on this, and also the funders for making this work possible. And finally, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
So that was an excellent talk, thanks very much. Going back to the flight towards the eye of the storm, so tuberoses have this propensity to fly kind of at crosswinds, and I wondered, like, the crosswinds being helpful for their flight, that kind of lead them to fly towards the eye of the storm automatically? You know, if they keep following crosswinds, will they eventually just make it to the eye of the storm almost by accident? Or is there kind of more of a directional, you know, does it not necessarily have to be going straight across the wind?
So I think that one of the things that was interesting was that when birds are circumnavigating the storm, then they're using tailwinds. So and then they're using crosswinds when they fly towards it. So we did wonder whether the outcome would just be kind of an automatic, like, I've got this rule, fly with a crosswind, that's what I do all the time, and I'll do it in storm as well. So I think the context dependency of their response sort of tells us that actually they are doing something particular in relation to storms. Yeah. And maybe I think it's also just worth saying that one of the reasons we did the agent-based modelling was to see whether, so that our GAM of flight direction with respect to the storm eye we said, okay, that we've got this response of how birds move in relation to the wind field. How do we know that takes them towards the eye? That's actually one of the reasons that we ran the agent-based models. It's like, okay, well, run the response. How often does it take them into or towards the eye? And we find that the probability of agents doing that is actually very similar to the probability of birds doing that. So, and we think that it is a particular response which has taken them towards the eye.
Great talk, Emily. Thank you. Did you explore at all whether their foraging behaviour was influenced by specific? Because you showed some really nice data about the percentage of time on the water. But did you see if, for example, it allows them forage in areas where they don't normally reach under lower wind speed conditions? So that's one initial question. If you don't mind, another one is did you get any sense that they can predict, or how far in advance they can predict where the eye is going to be? You can see the really nice sudden movement towards the eye it seems as if when a point is the wind is just beginning to really pick up, perhaps. But is there any sense that they might be able to predict it a bit further in advance?
Okay, yeah, nice question. So, firstly, does the storm enable them to reach new areas? It's not something that we looked at in a structured sense. I guess just the observation that the birds which were further away from their normal foraging area, that's where they were before the storm hit, and then they showed this different response to the storm. So their further out position didn't seem to be a result of the storm, but we didn't look at the likelihood of them operating in a given area and being related to whether there were storm conditions or not. That'd be interesting. And foraging, I've just lost the second one. Prediction, yes. Yeah. No, again, it's not something that we looked at particularly. I guess, so one of the things that was really notable was just how variable the storm systems were, and you've got a sense of it in some of those screen grabs I put up. And so the maximum wind speed can occur at a whole range of different distances from the birds. And I guess all our results showed was that they're definitely responding to the wind strength experienced where they are at that moment. So I guess any response would have to. They've got a lot of different factors to build in, but it did seem to be the wind speed that was driving their response. The most important thing.
That was a super talk, thank you. I was just wondering, from your work, have you been able to think about the implications for the renewable industry and how birds might respond around, turbines? So active flyers versus dynamic soarers and the responses into high wind speeds, and whether they're more likely to be vulnerable to collision or not.
I've thought about it in as much as I thought, that's really interesting. And I guess... turbulence is just going to be such a big deal around the turbines. And so the ability of birds to respond to, potentially even exploit gusts and this very highly variable flow field, I think is really interesting. I think getting to that is going to be really hard to be able to have time-resolved flow fields and in relation to the birds' movements. So I think I think it's really interesting, but I can't really say much more than that, I'm afraid.
Okay. Thanks very much, Emily. Well done for making the difference.
Oh, yeah, we have to.
There we go. Grant. Right, so we're going to kick off straight into our biologging session. We have Natasha Gillies, who's going to talk to us about some really new influences on seabird movement behaviour, talking about infrasound's influence on albatross foraging. Oh, yeah. And just, go on.
Just before everyone starts there, We're using a child's toy to get people to stick to time. So when you're giving your talk here, you will have a green light for 10 minutes, and then it goes to an orange light for 2 minutes that says you have 2 minutes remaining, and then it will beep at you and give you a red light that says, if you don't stop, someone is going to rugby tackle you off the stage. So we'll set this up so that the speaker can see this, and please try and use that to keep to time. Thanks.
Okay, did you hear that as well, Billy?
No, I didn't.
So it's a green light when you're up to 10 minutes, and then there's an orange light for the last 2 minutes.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, lovely. Cool.
Hi everyone. I'm Tash. I'm a postdoc at University of Liverpool, and today I'm going to be discussing some work we've been doing looking at whether infrasound might be a cue for movement decisions in the wandering albatross. So all seabirds have to go on foraging trips to sea that can exceed hundreds to thousands of kilometres for many species. And they have to go on these trips in the relatively featureless environment of the ocean. And because of this, they need far-ranging cues that can help them work out where profitable foraging patches are or to navigate home. So 4 of the key cues that have already been identified include vision, olfaction, magnetoreception, and even potentially hearing signals from conspecifics. But if you look at the spatial scale of these, most of these are relatively short-ranging, with the exception of magnetoreception, which may cover thousands of kilometres, but is relatively static when considering the duration of a normal foraging trip. And so we were interested in what sort of dynamic cues might provide long-range environment or long-range information about the environment. So with this in mind, we were using wandering albatross to look into these sort of potential long-distance cues. And there's some key reasons why albatrosses in particular can be useful for these sorts of questions. So firstly, albatrosses exhibit some of the longest foraging trips amongst seabirds, and these can easily exceed 10,000 kilometres. And this can be illustrated nicely by this one looping trip we have from an individual breeding on Crozet Island. In addition to this, albatrosses are very long-winged, and this in combination with their sheer soaring flight means that they're really highly dependent on windy and wavy areas to extract sufficient energy from the environment to move effectively. And because of this, albatrosses and wandering albatrosses in particular might be most likely to benefit from predicting long-range environmental conditions on their foraging trips. And this is where infrasound might come in. So infrasound is a form of very low-frequency sound. It's totally inaudible to humans, and it has a detection and propagation range that can exceed thousands of kilometres. Now, much of the early evidence for the use of infrasound by animals was relatively circumstantial, so you might see sort of avoidance or preemptive avoidance of earthquakes and storms by groups of animals. But since then, we have a bit more robust sort of behavioural evidence. So most famously, infrasound seems to be involved in communication for both Asian and African elephants, potentially blue whales as well. There are infrasonic components in the display of some species, including peacocks and capercaillies. And perhaps a bit more controversially, there's been some speculation that infrasound could be involved in homing in pigeons. But as yet, no one seems to have investigated whether infrasound could provide useful information in a movement context, and particularly in this foraging context. So in the marine environment, infrasound is generally generated by waves and ocean storms. So this map that you can see on the right is an infrasound source map, and this shows how infrasound looks in the Southern Ocean, where wandering albatross breed and forage. And so these very dark red and blue regions on the map indicate areas of high infrasound measured as sound pressure level. So within the ocean, the dominant class of infrasound is called microbaryons. They range from 0.1 to 0.5 hertz. And these are generated by weather and colliding ocean waves. And so we wondered if this might provide useful environmental information to animals that either want to move away from or perhaps move towards these sorts of environmental conditions. Now, wandering albatrosses, as I mentioned, go on these very long foraging trips, and so we thought they might benefit from this sort of long-range information. And so we wanted to investigate whether wandering albatross movements could be consistent with infrasound sensitivity. So there were three main components to our methods. So firstly, we developed novel infrasound propagation models, and they show how infrasound is perceived by individual birds in their trips. We combine this with a GPS tracking data set taken over a year of breeding for wandering albatross. And then we use a sort of modified resource selection model to test differences in environmental conditions in areas birds foraged. So focusing on our propagation maps to start with, this is an example of one on the right. These were first constructed by our colleague, Olivier Denauden, and these basically use existing weather data to model the propagation of infrasound across the bird's environment from that bird's perspective. So what can they actually hear at any one point on their foraging trip? Concurrently with this, we used a novel biologger called the infraear, which captures in situ infrasound data on the bird's foraging trips. And we compared the data collected on these biologgers with these modelled infrasound soundscapes to see how well the models were performing, and we got 85% agreement, which is pretty good. So concurrently with this, we were collecting GPS data from wandering albatross. So we equipped 89 incubating individuals, and this was carried out during 2013. And these collected GPS fixes on a 15-minute schedule. And so when we take all these data together, we get a map like I showed you earlier. So this is showing the distribution, foraging distribution of these birds in the Southern Ocean. You can see females are tending to go north here, and they're the ones in blue, and males tending to go south in yellow. We combine this data with instantaneous wind data. Specifically, we were interested in wind direction relative to the bird's trajectory and instantaneous wind speed. And then finally, we used hidden Markov models to broadly characterize behavioral states during the trip. So specifically, we looked at rest, sustained flight, and foraging. And then we combined this to look at how environmental conditions were varying on the birds' trips. So I'm just going to give a sort of simplified overview of this, but if anyone wants to chat later, I'd be very happy to. So firstly, we took bouts of sustained flight during the birds' foraging trips. So these were bouts of flight that were equal to or exceeded 20 kilometres. And we took the first point in this bout. And we assumed that this would be a major decision point for movement, so it's the point at which they decide where to go. And this is because on bouts of flight, they tend to show relatively directed trajectories. We then compared the environmental conditions in this chosen direction to all available conditions for the bird. And in doing this, we focused on both instantaneous wind conditions and this long-range infrasound propagation. And our idea here was to disentangle responses of the bird to their immediate conditions from possible long-range indicators of environmental conditions. Now, I just want to focus on the infrasound component of that for a moment. So this is a sort of schematic of an infrasound propagation map. So we take our birds that are about to begin a period of commuting flight, and we separate the area around that bird into 6 segments of 60 degrees each. This was chosen to maximize variation between segments. We call the segment containing its bearing the focal segment, and then we summed infrasound components over a 2,000 kilometre radius from that position. And this is because this captures 95% of the total acoustic power. We then did the same thing for the remaining 5 segments and looked at whether there were differences in this focal segment to these unchosen segments. So firstly, we looked at the effects of wind conditions, as we already know that these are important to albatross movement. So here I'm showing odds ratio in the y-axis. So this is a measure of the likelihood that the bird selected the focal segment against wind direction, where 0 degrees is a tailwind and 180 is a headwind. And I'm going to show you this for very strong and very weak winds. So in strong winds, birds showed a preference for tailwinds, which we would expect. In weak winds, they seem to show a slight preference for headwinds, but it was a relatively weak effect. Now, this isn't very surprising. These findings align with previous results that wind is highly important to albatross foraging movement. They have very long wings and high wing loading, which means very high energetic cost to taking off and manoeuvring in flight. And so they do need to take advantage of winds to soar whenever possible. So this aligned with sort of expectations. More interestingly, though, we then looked at potential effects of infrasound. So here we still have that odds ratio on the y-axis and standardized sound pressure on the x-axis. And I'm going to show you responses in tailwinds and headwinds, so we looked at an interactive effect here. So for tailwinds, first of all, it looked like birds were more likely to select segments that had higher infrasound, and actually the effect of that was very strong. Conversely, in headwinds, which are much less efficient for movement, we saw very little effect of infrasound. So it seemed there was a strong interaction with wind conditions. Now, responding to instantaneous wind is really important to efficient flight, as Emily very nicely showed in her plenary this morning. However, it's really important to know where you're actually going, and to that extent, it might be useful to sort of predict long-range weather conditions. Now, we know that infrasound is associated with both windy and wavy conditions, and we also know that these might be beneficial for wandering albatross to forage effectively. And so with this in mind, we wondered if infrasound could provide an important indicator of environmental conditions that allow albatrosses to search for prey at relatively low movement costs. So in the marine environment, seabirds have to depend on a sort of multi-sensory system of cues, because depending on just one indicator is likely to be less efficient to movement. And so we propose that infrasound might be one component of this multi-sensory system that aids these sort of movement decisions. Now, infrasound is also associated with coastal land masses, and though we didn't investigate this here, it's also possible that it could be a means to facilitate navigation or homing. And so we propose that with our novel infrasound maps, alongside some form of in-situ data collection with something like the infraear, this might be something that could be studied in other free-ranging animals and other contexts as well. So just to finish, I'll leave you with three take-home messages. So firstly, we think that we found the first direct evidence of behavioural responses to infrasound in a free-ranging bird within this foraging context. Secondly, we speculate that these cues might help birds to identify favourable foraging conditions that can help them search for prey at these low movement costs, or potentially, and perhaps controversially, even navigate it. And finally, novel methods for measuring and modelling infrasound that we've been helping to develop could help future study of this kind in other similar species. So thank you very, very much for listening, and happy to take questions.
Thanks. Very interesting talk. I was just wondering, is there any evidence for for birds in general, or albatrosses' ability to actually sense infrasound? Has anyone looked at that?
It's a tricky thing to do, because ideally you want a lab study, and that's much more challenging to do in a wandering albatross. So this study forms part of a wider project looking at infrasound sensitivity in seabirds. And so one component of that is to look at the sort of physiological aspects of that and what evidence we can see that they might be able to detect it. And there have been lab studies in other birds that have been able to detect sensitivity, but as I say, this hasn't been possible in albatrosses yet.
Thanks for a super talk. How is the infrasound environment affected by human activities like shipping, do you think?
It's a good question. So one reason that focusing on the marine environment might be useful is because it might be less affected than on land, where infrasound is affected by sort of everything from traffic to construction, things like this. It probably is affected by movement of boats, at sea construction, things like nuclear testing, and there's been other sort of correlative studies looking at how human activities can affect animal movement and how this might link to infrasound. So my favourite is there was a case where there was a homing pigeon race that was massively disrupted the birds were sort of on their trajectory and suddenly started going in all sorts of directions and they couldn't work out why. And in retrospect, they've realised that Concorde had taken off quite nearby, and the speculation was the sort of sound disruption from that takeoff might have disturbed the pigeons. This sort of started some of the investigation into potential homing relevance. So there probably are anthropogenic impacts as well.
It's another general question, because this is quite new to me. So when we're trying to think about this and seabirds, and should we sort of perceive this as somewhat similar to sound, and therefore it might be quite diluted, it might be echoing of things, and therefore a more complex navigation tool than perhaps visual? Is that, would that be a right way to think about it?
Yeah, I guess that's one of the potential interests here, is that it can affect, or it can range in the environment for so many different reasons. So you have this association with storms, you have this association with waves, and you have this association with landmass, so that would be the echoing as well. So I think we're at a very early stage in sort of recognising how those different aspects of the sort of sound environment might impact on birds. So I guess at this stage it's a bit speculative. But yeah, there are a huge number of ways that this might be perceived by animals and how they might respond to them. Thank you.
Next up, it's lovely to welcome Ash Bennison back to UCC. Do I need to do anything here?
Okay, good morning. Thank you for having me today. I'd like to talk to you about some work we've been doing recently looking at lateralised foraging in gannets, or to use its common name, handedness. So today I'm going to just go through a bit of what is lateralisation first, for those that may not have come across it before. I'll talk about examples in other animals and seabirds. We'll talk specifically about gannets. And then we'll go on to talk about how we investigate lateralisation, and I'll take you through some of our analysis and some summary conclusions. So to put it simply, lateralisation is the idea that many, many animals will prefer to use one side of their body for a given task over another side. So you can think of this as an inherited or a learnt trait. Sometimes it does seem to have a genetic component to it, but we're still learning on that side of things. But the general theory behind it is that to learn to do a complex task is and develop the neural circuitry to undertake this sort of task is incredibly energetically expensive. So it's much more efficient to only develop this circuitry and only develop this ability once on one side of your body. And it's seen in nearly all living taxa. There are a phenomenal number of studies in fish, actually. The zebrafish in particular have been shown to show lateralisation in terms of their navigating abilities. Killer whales preferentially will breach and land on their left side of their body over their right side of their body. There's also a phenomenal amount of literature in chickens. Chickens will prefer to use one eye over another, and that is a pattern that we tend to see in a lot of different birds, that they have an eye preference. So we also get this idea of a population bias. You can either have a fairly even split between animals of, say, 50-50% of either a left-aligned animal or a right-aligned animal, but you can also have, as in the case of humans, we can have 10% of us being lefties. And what the really interesting part of this is that if you consider when you may see a lateralised behaviour, it could have survival or even fitness advantages. So if an animal undertakes a lateralised behaviour during foraging, you can perhaps assume that there might be some sort of advantage in undertaking it from a lateralised perspective. So looking at it from a seabird context, it's relatively unexplored. And I think of this as a prime candidate. We've got seabirds travelling often quite long distances to undertake some very cool foraging. And it's been seen a bit in seabirds. Penguins have been shown a couple of times to undertake colony-specific lateralised behaviours, particularly in their preferred foot use in fighting or in obstacle avoidance. They will approach it on their right side often. And in Caspian terns, we find that when they bring food back to their chicks, they are bill loaders, we see that they often align the head of the fish to the left side of their body, which does imply some sort of foraging interaction. But to look at it in gannets, they're the largest seabird in the North Atlantic, and for me that's very interesting because there's a huge expense of them getting around. But they are incredibly wide-ranging. They'll travel several hundred kilometres just to undertake a foraging trip. And we see this individual specialisation in them as well. Some of them are well known to undertake particularly discard foraging, and some of them won't. But they also have this quite cool complex foraging behaviour, and I'm sure we all know the plunge diving behaviour of gannets. But I do just want to take a moment, and I hope this works. Yes. So to look at the anatomy of a plunge dive in a gannet, we do seem to have these three stages. We'll have a hovering stage whilst an animal is prey searching, and then there seems to be an almost rotation along their x-axis. So you see here the bird here is rolling onto its left side and immediately taking a plunge dive down. And so we hypothesized that if this is a behavior that can perhaps is complex, and there needs to be several things happening here at the same time, there needs to be prey location, there needs to be body manipulation, and perhaps even an awareness of conspecifics. So perhaps this is a prime candidate for looking for lateralised behaviour. So how do we explore that phenomenon in itself? So we had a wealth of tracking data. From Great Salty here we had 14 birds tracked with GPS and accelerometry, but we also had 57 birds tracked from grass home to which we had the accelerometry data. And we undertook a dive detection analysis, and we used thresholding for this approach. And that was effectively the idea of you can look at when gannets decelerate massively and very, very quickly, you can assume that that is a dive. And we took the mean roll in 5 seconds preceding a dive for all the dives of an individual bird, and you can start to assess how repeatable this is. So the first thing to use is a lateralisation index, and this is something that was initially proposed back in the 70s. And it effectively looks at the ratio of left to right behavioured events for any given individual. And it can give you ranges from -1 to 1, and we generally consider that an animal will be lateralised or handed if the values are either less than 0.25, minus 0.25, or more than 0.25. But it's not particularly robust. It doesn't really allow you to build in any sort of environmental parameters around it. So we're also using a repeatability analysis. It's using the repeat R package in R. It effectively lets you build linear mixed effect models, and it can give you a repeatability factor, an R value, for grouping factors such as, effectively random effects. And here we're using date, just to account for any environmental sort of repeatability in wind. We're also looking at it in terms of ID. But to build a little further on the environmental facts, we're going to build a model that looks at dive angle. So not only are we going left or right side, we're looking at how far the birds rotate over. And this was on a subsample of our birds that we had the GPS data for. We also appended to every dive the European Centre for Medium Range weather forecast data, and that's through MoveBank. And we compared this to in any given position from the GPS data where a bird was diving, the wind speed, the offset, so that is the angle from the bird's trajectory to the wind direction, and also what we're calling wind roll, and that was a binary impact, a factor of whether the bird was diving into the wind or away from the wind. So, results. We managed to get 2,133 dives from 51 birds. And using the lateralisation index, we can see that 22 of them are right-sided, 26 of them are left-sided, and 3 of them are what I'm going to boldly claim is ambidextrous. Now, these lateralisation indexes are pretty cool. Actually, it turns out that the ones that are sided, pretty much every single one of their dives went to the side that you could assign from there. And we saw no generic population bias. It's about a 50-50 split. But we wanted to look at it a bit further and use the repeatability analysis. So this let us build up this grouping factor of dive side, grouped by the individual, and we found that we've got a repeatability at 0.8. So that's really, really high repeatability, and the date also then didn't really have any impact on this. To look at the wind, I'm not going to bore you too much with these tables, but what I want you to look at is the top table, and you can find that in the model we used in the repeatability of ID, with no fixed effects, with just the grouping factor of ID and date on the dive angle, so that how far they rolled over in their dive. We found that there was a decent amount of repeatability, but the wind effects actually barely touched the sides on this. What really is then quite interesting is then when you build in the lateralised side of the bird. So you're looking at this angle, and it's either diving on a negative angle or a positive angle, depending on which way it rolled, and you include the internal lateralised state of the bird. So left birds diving on left angles, that repeatability factor drops down. So what we're seeing is that internal state is responsible for the angle birds dive at, but there's still a little factor in there. There's still something that might be driving this angle as well. So a bit of a summary on this. We found that gannets do in fact engage in lateralised behaviour during foraging. And we've also found that there is a bit of an agreement between the lateralisation index and repeatability. This is something that in the field people have talked about as to which direction and which method is best to use. We also found there's a minimal effect on wind, both on the side of the direction birds are diving, but also on the angle that they take themselves. But what's the next steps on this? Where do we want to go from here? So I really want to look at the impacts for the wider ecology. There's some really, really cool research in chickens that suggests that the different eye preference that an individual may have may actually start to impact their spatial cognitive abilities, or their memory, or their awareness of conspecifics. So this may yet have wider impacts on free-ranging animals. I'm also interested in the origins of this behaviour. It'd be really, really interesting to start to look at, is this an inherited behaviour in seabirds or in gannets? Or is this, in fact, a learnt behaviour, which might then imply different ratios for different populations, potentially? And finally, examples in other seabirds. We don't yet know an awful lot about this, so if anyone does want to look at this, I would be very, very interested in having a chat later. And I'll leave you there with saying thank you very much, and I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash. Really, really cool. Do you trust the wind data, or do you think we might have a stronger effect if we had finer scale data available?
Well, you did the wind data, didn't you?
Is that a reason not to trust it?
I think in the short answer, it's difficult to say. Our GPS was at, a 2-minute interval. The wind data was provided at a 3-hourly prediction. And so you're instantly looking at a mismatch here, but then you've got the idea that if gannets do preferentially dive either into the wind or out of the wind within 2 minutes, they are more than capable of orientating themselves round and diving either with or against the wind. I think what's important is that at the scale we're looking at, we're barely even seeing a signal for this. So the key take home for me is that whilst it may have an impact, the key driver in this is the internal state of the bird.
Great, thank you.
I just wondered how you might identify that sidedness in other species, like, say, guillemot pursuing some prey. How would you, what biologging technique would you use to find out, like, which eye it was using in preference or something?
That's a really good question. I think ultimately this comes down to having a knowledge of your species. We found this, for us, this initially came of a conversation that we learned that this is a bigger thing than we realized. And then we went away and we just happened to notice when we were watching gannets, we're like, oh, they do actually roll over when they're diving. Let's try and find that signal. So I think there is a very key part here to knowing your species and knowing for them what might be the key point. Now, a big theory behind this is that it's at key points within an animal's ecology. So it's these complex tasks that they undertake. So I'm not a guillemot specialist, but you could start to think that there is a whole specialized sort of area of that underwater foraging. That might then start to become more of an impact then. So get to know, and then we'll have a chat over a pint later, I'm sure, and we can work it out.
Hi, is there any correlation between the age of the bird and what side they're picking, or is there any ideas on that?
Oh, I'd love to know. In gannets, no. This is, as far as I understand, this is the first time we've looked at it in gannets. But they have found that in birds particularly, it can be a bit more flexible to young age. But what's very interesting as well, in chickens and pigeons, in fact, the lateralised side is often done by which side up the egg lays. So depending on which side gets the most light can impact that laterality. Now that really gets interesting then, because a lot of birds will turn eggs. So you'd have to then start to think beyond that what that means. Yes. No, it's a fair question. Now, we actually had a mix of males and females, and I should have mentioned this as we were going through, but we didn't find any sex bias. So we found roughly equal numbers of males and females being both left and right aligned, or winged. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks Ash. So next up we have Sarah Saldanha, and she's going to talk about how we're going to use auxiliary sensors to improve our behaviour classification using GPS trackers alone. Just start.
Hi. So I'll be presenting part of my PhD work here. Understanding where an animal feeds or forages is really important for understanding their interactions with the environment, and also looking at potential human-animal conflicts. In seabirds, we're getting a lot further with that. With tracking data, we're finding out where they're traveling to. And with the increase of tracking data, we're also using much more techniques in order to infer behavior from GPS tracks to understand where the animal is foraging, resting, or traveling. So the first studies that were doing this were mainly using just the speed of the GPS track. And with that, you can know if the bird is resting or if it's active. But nowadays, we're also using a lot of the angle of the movements in order to separate active behavior into foraging and traveling, with the concept of area-restricted search, where the birds are spending more time in more angular movements while they're foraging, in compared to when they're traveling and they're doing really long directed movements. Mainly, this has been worked with birds with commuting trips, which is when they're really traveling to a specific location where they're foraging and then returning back to the colony. This is often the case with shearwaters, for example, that are feeding in an upwelling system. But it's not so clear how well these models are working with birds that use looping trip or more opportunistic foraging throughout their trips. So in order to test whether these models are working or not, we can use cross-validation. So you can look at directly looking at the behavior of the bird through observation or through camera footage. But often the case of seabirds, when they're in these really remote areas and we can't really see how they're behaving, we're using auxiliary sensors such as time depth recorders or accelerometry or immersion loggers to understand a bit more about their behaviors. Unfortunately, there's very few studies that use cross-validation, so a lot of the time we use the model, we have the behavioral classifications, and just by a visual inspection of the trips, we say, okay, it looks pretty good. But we don't usually go further than that and really separate how well these models are predicting the behaviors. And the studies that do use cross-validation often find that the accuracy of these models is varying quite a bit between the model itself. So there's many different models that can be used right now, and every day there are more. And also the GPS fixed interval, for example. So when you have a GPS position every second, you're getting a much more precise image of the animal's behavior compared to if you have a GPS fix every 15 minutes or even every 2 hours. And also we're seeing that there's differences between species and their foraging strategies, like I was talking to about before with the looping versus commuting trips. So if you want to model behavior, how can you improve your models? Well, the first step that you could do if you're starting up now is trying to reduce the GPS fixed interval. But of course, this is not always possible. If a bird is doing really long foraging trips, you have some battery limitations, so it's not always possible. Another thing that you could do is include additional auxiliary data, so accelerometers, wet dry or TDR, to really understand the behavior of the birds. Unfortunately, this means that you're spending more money, and it's also, there's more weight limitations for the birds. So because of this, whenever you have auxiliary data, a lot of the time it's only a small subset of the full GPS data. So I'm suggesting that we can maybe use these small subsets to semi-supervise a larger GPS data set to infer behavior at a higher accuracy. So my objectives were to assess whether semi-supervision of hidden Markov models, which is a very common model used right now for behavior classification, can increase in accuracy when you're adding in this auxiliary data. And I'm also looking at whether it's equal between the three main behavioral modes, so resting, foraging, and traveling, and whether it can reach inference levels that are equal to commuting trips. I'm working with a species with a looping trip in my case, which is the red-billed tropicbird, which, as its name suggests, is a tropical species, and it has these really long looping trips that you can see here. So I worked on quite a large, substantial data set of GPS trips with 1,082 GPS trips that were collected in collaboration with local NGOs in Cabo Verde. And of that large GPS data set, I had this small subset of data with auxiliary data. So I had 34 trips with accelerometry and TDR, 90 trips with immersion or wet-dry data, and 16 trips with all three types of auxiliary data, so accelerometry, TDR, and wet-dry. So I first set off to classify the behavior of the bird based on these auxiliary data sets. So for example, here I have some accelerometry data and some TDR data at the bottom, which I classified, well, the accelerometry I classified with a random forest model into whether the bird was flapping, so in this flapping flight with high acceleration, whether it was diving or on water after a dive. And I had the same thing with the TDR in this case. And with the wet-dry data, I was separating it out into whether the bird was resting or constantly on water or in some way active. So with that, I was able to classify the resting, foraging, or traveling behavior of 66% of this auxiliary data set and 7.1% of the full GPS data set that I had. But of course, in order to do the cross-validation, I had to leave out 10%. So I did this over 10 different iterations with different 10%. So later on, you'll see when I'm looking at the plots and things, the maximum known states that I have is 56% for the auxiliary data set and 6.3 for the full GPS data set, because of that, leaving out the 10%. So I included these into the HMMs with an increasing proportion to see how that would increase the accuracy, and then I validate the model inferences with confusion matrices. So here's an example of a trip, a tropicbird trip, colored based on the behavior that I had from the known states. So in this case, yellow is resting, and you can see, let's say here, the animal was drifting on water. It was classified as resting throughout. CN is traveling, and red is foraging, where I picked up some dives. And the smaller positions are the ones that were added into the model as the known states, whereas the larger positions were used as the cross-validation. And so when I ran my models with semi-supervision, I was able to test whether I had more or less correct classifications. So at the top here, I have an unsupervised model with the incorrect classifications in red and the correct ones in green. At the bottom, it's semi-supervised. And you can see that there's fewer incorrect in the semi-supervised. So it is working a little bit, although there are still some red positions that were poorly identified. And so what does that look like in the confusion matrices? So here to the left is one that was unsupervised, and to the right was supervised. And a couple things that come up quickly here is that I had a very unbalanced data set. So my known states, which are on the x-axis here, there's far more resting known states because tropicbirds spend like 60% of their time resting on water in comparison to traveling and foraging. And the predictions were generally good for resting and traveling, but quite horrible for foraging. And although the model did improve significantly with the semi-supervision, especially for resting and traveling, foraging remained quite confused. So if your model was quite good, you would have a strong diagonal color here, but you can see that in the middle it's completely lacking. And so how does this look like when you take out the metrics from these confusion matrices? So this is a plot of the accuracy, the global model accuracy, with an increasing proportion of known states for my auxiliary data set. So this is going from 0 to 50%, 56% of known states. And there's overall an increase in the model accuracy, which is what we saw. The model is being improved overall. But when you break it down into the behaviors, looking at, in this case, the sensitivity, the proportion of accurately predicted occurrences of a behavior, you can see that for resting and traveling, well, resting it's really good, traveling it's pretty good, and for foraging it's quite bad, although it did improve with the semi-supervision. In the case of specificity, which is the proportion of accurately predicted non-occurrences of behavior, we're getting a somewhat similar trend where resting is being improved here, and foraging and traveling are quite high, but that's also because of the very unbalanced data set I have. So because there's so many resting positions, that's taking a large weight overall. And finally, the precision, which is the proportion of predicted occurrences that are correct. I'm seeing the increase in resting and an increase in traveling, but foraging is kind of all over the place and not quite stable, and also very low. And this is important because it's showing us that not only are we having trouble predicting foraging, like a lot of the positions that we're classifying as foraging are missed, but also the ones that we are classifying are often incorrect. When I projected this onto the full GPS data set, I had similar trends where there was an increase with the model, overall model accuracy with the inclusion of semi-supervision here. And that, again, it was quite well for resting, but not so good for foraging overall. So my conclusions are that semi-supervision was able to increase the hidden Markov model accuracy with the inclusion of no states into the model. But unfortunately, this increase was uneven among the main behavioral modes, so specificity and precision of foraging mode remained quite low. Sensitivity and foraging remained quite low. And because of this, so not only were the foraging positions going undetected, but they were also often wrongly classified. And so I suggest that although this is a really useful tool for improving your behavioral classifications and models, a lot of caution should be taken for opportunistic foragers such as tropicbirds, where I think we have to kind of rethink how we understand foraging in these animals, because basically, if they are foraging opportunistically throughout their trip, then they're in a searching mode almost all the time while they're active. So it might not be necessary to try and separate specific prey capture attempts from just active behavior. And finally, the choice of auxiliary sensors that you may use to try and improve your models could be based on the specific ecology of the species, processing time, and costs. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all the people that helped with everything.
Hi, sorry. It was a really excellent talk. So your results also add to increasing evidence that HMMs are not very good at classifying foraging behaviour at the population level and are potentially really bad at the individual level. With all these other biologging devices that you were able to use, do you have any recommendations for what other parameters people might need to start to look at if they really do want to isolate foraging behaviour from other behavioural traits?
So in the case that, from what I was working with, so I had accelerometry, TDR, and the wet dry. I wasn't able to get specific prey capture attempts with the wet dry data, although it was like really good for known states in my species because they were resting a lot of the time, so I was able to get a lot of resting. I wasn't able to get prey capture. So I would suggest generally that accelerometry or the time depth recorders are probably the best for really picking up prey capture events. But of course, the processing time for accelerometry in comparison to TDR is very different. So it might be, depending a lot on your species and how you expect them to forage and everything. Yeah.
Hi, that was a really good talk. With the GPS data that you used where you didn't have any auxiliary data, did you have different resolutions in there? And if you did you find that, say, the better resolution data had better predictions in the model?
Everything I had was at 5 minutes for the GPS, so I wasn't able to look at that, but I know there's a couple new studies that have looked at the resolution of data, and it does really improve the classification, but especially when you get down to at 1 second interval. It's really good. So there's a recent paper that came up using deep learning to classify behaviors, and they're using 1 second intervals, and it was like a 90x%, which was really good. But they also compared different models in that paper, and they were showing that hidden Markov models, although they do have some trouble classifying behavior, they are a little bit more resistant to larger resolution times in comparison to something like deep learning. So that's also something to take into account when you're choosing how to go about it. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you.
Mm-hmm.